Today we're going to continue our topic of last class, which was the trying to understand theodicy, trying to understand the existence of evil. And what our class will aim to do today is to go over some of the classical doctrines of Islam, some of the schools of theology that have already attempted to answer this issue in the last 14 centuries. Now, before we even begin, I want to teach you the methodology of research, which is, you all know this from your own high school and undergraduate years. When you have a problem, we have a problem of trying to understand evil. You always begin by seeing how previous intellectuals, previous scholars attempted to solve that problem. Because generally speaking, almost every issue that you're going to be asking, you're not the first human being to ask. And so rather than start from scratch, rather than reinvent the wheel, you should see what the literature already says, see what previous groups have said, and then after you have done a survey, you can assess, has enough research been done that satisfies you? Or do you think there's still more that needs to be done? So the question of evil, the question of theodicy, is not a new question, as I've explained. In fact, it goes back, as I explained, thousands of years. Therefore, various Muslim groups have attempted to solve this problem throughout their writings. So today I'm going to give you a quick crash course about three of the earlier groups. And when I give these three, obviously, many caveats. Firstly, there's many other groups. Obviously, in the history of Islam, there's many groups. Secondly, the fact that I'm mentioning other groups doesn't mean I endorse them, okay? And thirdly, this is a quick crash course. Each one of these you can spend a lot of time doing. Now, I want to ask you a question. What are some of I talked about the positives of looking at past research. What are some of the negatives that might happen when you attempt to answer a question by going to past answers? What are some of the negatives that might potentially happen as a researcher? Who can tell me? Yes. Okay, so the answers of the past might be contextually disconnected. Good. What else? Yes. So one of the biggest problems of reading other materials is something called anchor bias or confirmation bias. What is confirmation bias? It's also called anchor bias. Confirmation bias is when you have a blank slate, you don't know anything about a subject, and your first bit of information, your first aspect that you hear, it kind of anchors you, it situates you such that everything else after that, it is going to be related to the first notion or the first concept that came to you. An example of this, which actually you should be aware of when you're going to be applying to job market, is the salary, right? That there's always this awkward reality. Who's going to say the first salary? Who's going to give the first number? Your boss asks you, what are you expecting? What are you thinking? And suppose they had in their mind, they're going to give you up to 120, but they're going to begin negotiation at 100. And you're like happy with 75. So you're like, I want at least 75. So automatically there's a bias there that you've dropped it down, or vice versa. Or even, suppose even more radical than this, suppose you had no idea how much an icon or an item costs. So you have no idea, right? Somebody says, how much you think this costs, right? And if you have absolutely no idea, you're like, how much? You tell me. If they begin with that 10,000 or 15,000, you're going to think, if I get this for 8,000, that's a bargain. Because you already have a bias, whereas in reality, it could be worth maybe 50 or 100. Because you're anchoring, because you're beginning something. So too, when you're talking about theodicy and you haven't studied this topic at all, the first time somebody explains it to you, automatically it is possible that it will influence everything else that you read. So you have to be aware. Now obviously you have to begin somewhere. So yes, you're always going to begin with some type of confirmation bias. That's fine. Be aware of it and realize that your first bit of information isn't necessarily your most accurate one. You might actually have a spark of genius. That is rare. It does happen though. You might have a spark of genius and literally potentially think outside the box. But because the box has been drawn for you, you are not able to think outside the box because you've already constructed a box by reading the past. Okay, that is one of the biases, one of the problems of past. And of course, it is a necessary problem. There's no way around it because you have to do that. You just have to be aware, that's all, right? Because a part of this class is to teach you how to think critically. All of us are biased. I said this multiple times. The least biased person is the one who recognizes his or her biases. All of us have inherent biases. The least biased person recognizes the biases so that they can begin to grapple with them. Another issue or problem that comes when you read past research, and this is unique to the type of context we are doing, is sectarian bias. So I'm going to present to you three madhabs of aqeedah: the Mu'tazila, the Asha'ira, and the Athariya. There are more than these. I'm going to present to you three philosophical, theological schools. This represents a massive problem. We're going to come back to this problem in our series of lectures, and that is the problem of figuring out the minute details of truth within the truth of Islam, right? As a default, we are Sunni. I'm assuming all of you are Sunni. If not, you're welcome to come, no problem. But you should know that generically we are Sunni. I am Sunni. As a default, that is my paradigm. Now, this represents another issue of research. How independent can you be when you've already decided that you're going to follow the Sunni paradigm? That is another issue you need to take into account. Is it wrong to follow a group that you belong to? Not inherently, no, because in the end of the day, you are not able to become a top-notch researcher in every single field. So you must delegate authority to people whom you trust. And so if you have come to the conclusion that, generically speaking, the Quran, the Sunnah, respect of the Sahabah, this is how I live my life, well, that's Sunnism. Now, in this very intricate issue of theodicy, you come across the Mu'tazila said this, I'm just saying the 12ers said this, the Iblees said this, the Zaydis said this, the Sunni said this. Frankly, I'm telling you, it is safer for you to just jump and say, I'm just going to follow Sunnism, even if I don't fully understand everything. It's okay to make taqleed. It's okay. You don't have to be in fact, you cannot be a mujtahid in every single field, right? Just like in medicine, if you're not a doctor, you follow the doctor. In engineering, in architecture, if you're not a specialist, whatever the plans come from the building, and if it's an expert and you trust, well then unless you find another expert, you will just follow that person. Now when it comes to sectarianism, it's a little bit more difficult because we've already committed to a sect. Nonetheless, I don't see it a problem to teach you other schools. And then, you can at least acknowledge and see that every school is grappling with this issue in its own paradigm. So, with that rather lengthy caveat, I'm going to quickly go over three paradigms. The first of them is the Mu'tazili paradigm. Why did I begin with the Mu'tazila? The Mu'tazila are the first theologically constructed school of Islam. You will say, I thought that was Sunnism. And I'll respond, nope. Historically, the first group that systematically developed what is recognizable theology are the Mu'tazila. Sunnism was a reaction to the Mu'tazila. Sunnism was forced to fill in the gaps or to counter what the Mu'tazila wrote. That doesn't mean it's right and wrong. I'm just telling you, historically speaking, the first group of intellectuals who started thinking about these issues and started elaborating on them, that group eventually became known as the Mu'tazila. And of course, we're going to come back to these groups over and over again because we have to. It's a part of knowing our history. In a nutshell, when Islam first conquered the remnants of the Byzantine Empire, they came across Christian theologians, right, who followed Melkite Christianity, who followed Byzantine Orthodox Christianity, and the controversies that were occurring within that spectrum were transferred over to Islam. And those controversies dealt with predestination, free will. They dealt with the nature of God and the attributes. And that's exactly what happened with Islamic theology then. Islamic theology became also concerned and obsessed with free will and determination. And Islamic theology also became obsessed with and concerned about the attributes of God. And so the Mu'tazila, by and large, viewed the Byzantine Christian theologians as being role models. They wouldn't say that, but in the end of the day, they admired them. So the Mu'tazila kind of sort of Islamicized what they were saying. Instead of God the Father, they said Allah. Instead of this. And they started basically preaching a theology that eventually became, this is again, they weren't yet called Mu'tazila. Eventually it became what is called Mu'tazili Islam. Now in response, the scholars who weren't exposed to Byzantine theology were scratching their heads. This doesn't sound Quranic to us. It doesn't sound like our tradition. So they extrapolated what eventually became Sunnism. Does that make sense? Okay. Now I'm being very simplistic, but this so that we understand. Now even Sunnism has multiple strands, as we're going to come to. Let's begin with the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila, what they conceived of God, their primary emphasis of God was that God was a just being. God did everything fair and square. Everything must be fair. So they gave primacy to the doctrine of Allah having adl, Allah being just. And this implied that Allah Azza wa Jal had delegated to mankind their actions. Allah is not in charge of us directly. He's indirectly in charge, but Allah has given us a mini power to do as we please. Because the Mu'tazila argued, it's not fair. This is all predetermination, predestination, Qadr. It's not fair that Allah forces you to do something and then rewards you or punishes you for it. That was their notion of, that's why the Mu'tazila denied Qadr. The Mu'tazila affirmed free will, ultimate free will. And as you should all be aware of the arkan of Iman is we believe in Qadr. And the Mu'tazila denied Qadr because they said God is all just. And God cannot, they use the word force. Sunnis don't use that word. Remember, another point you should learn. Anytime an opponent talks about you, they will exaggerate. They will use words or descriptions you're not very happy about. That's the reality. When your enemy talks about you, they might give half-truths and they're going to paint something that you did in a very negative light. That's the way the world works, right? So similarly, when the Mu'tazila describes Sunnis, they kind of sort of exaggerated. Sunnism doesn't say forced, but the Mu'tazila used the word. God cannot force you and then reward you or punish you. Therefore, God must allow you to have ultimate free will, and therefore, where does evil come from for the Mu'tazila? Who can tell me based on what I just said? From within us. Once you remove God as being the actor on this earth, like for humans, so then evil is generated by human beings. Human beings are the source of evil. Allah did not create evil according to them, but He allowed, He gave mankind the capacity. And mankind has that free will. And hence, if man does good, he shall be rewarded. And if man does evil, so man does evil, not God. If man does evil, then they will be held accountable. God knows but does not control. That's what the Mu'tazila said. God knows the future. He does not control the future. Hence, Allah is removed from the actual operating in the realm of human action. You cannot describe an evil action as having anything to do with Allah. Murder, injustice, dhulm, stealing, all of this is coming from mankind. So Allah Azza wa Jal has nothing to do with evil. Now, they also said though, that because Allah is benevolent, because He is just, He must act in a manner that is always in the best interest of His creation. He must take care, He's obliged. He has a moral duty to take care of His creation. He has a moral duty to do what is just and to create a creation that is the best of all possible worlds. Therefore, if there is harm done by mankind to mankind, then God's justice requires that the evil person shall be punished and the one who was harmed shall be rewarded. So there is a moral obligation on Allah to punish the person who does evil and to reward the person that has done harm. Therefore, for the Mu'tazila, to summarize, being very simplistic, because again, this is entire classes can be done. Since Allah is perfectly just and perfectly wise, He cannot will evil actions. Instead, evil comes from human choices. Humans create evil. Humans are the source of evil. People decide to do evil. And that decision, they bear responsibility, not Allah. If Allah allows them, that's the only way Allah can therefore reward the one who does good and punish the one who does evil. And they also argued that when there is suffering, when there is hardship, there is always a hidden wisdom or greater good in this world that we shall be able to recognize. The Mu'tazila affirmed that man's intellect can recognize good from evil, and man can see and judge good and judge evil, and it is mankind that is creating that evil, not Allah. This is in a nutshell what the Mu'tazila say. Why did Sunnis find this problematic? At first level, explanation, it sounds pretty interesting, pretty nice. It solidly solves the problem that mankind is in charge of evil, not God. So you solve theodicy by removing God from the picture. It was precisely because you remove God from the picture that Sunnis found this heretical and problematic. It was precisely because God becomes an inactive bystander. The Sunnis wanted Allah to be Allah. They could not envision a God that doesn't act like a God. And the God of the Mu'tazila for the Sunnis seemed to be a passive God that actually gave, and this is the accusation the Sunnis gave to the Mu'tazila. Again, the accusations are exaggerated. The Sunnis actually accused the Mu'tazila of being Manichaean. Remember we talked about that last week, right? Why did the Sunnis accuse the Mu'tazila of being Manichaean? Because the Manichaeans affirmed there's a God of good and a God of evil, right? So the Sunni said to the Mu'tazila, you guys are becoming Manichaean because you're saying Allah creates good and you guys create evil. Now obviously the Mu'tazila didn't say that, but again, that's what happens when you're hashing it out. That's what happens when you have a fight and you're trying to just throw the worst possible interpretation, right? I've said this to you multiple times, guys. Never ever accept the testimony of a critic. Never accept the testimony of a hater. Never accept the witness of somebody who doesn't like or is outside. You have to take somebody who is neutral or inside. So when the Sunnis described the Mu'tazila, they said, what you're doing is that you are basically debilitating the power of God. You're limiting God's powers and you are giving the power of creation to mankind. Again, the Mu'tazila didn't do that, but this is the accusation that is given. And another problem that they had is that the language of the Mu'tazila was deemed to be blasphemous. God is obliged to do this. God has a moral duty to do this for His creation. The Sunnis said, how can you oblige Allah to do something? Who are you? What higher power is there that Allah has to answer to? What higher authority is there? What higher moral code is there? When the Mu'tazila said that God must do this and God must follow, the laws of ethics and the laws of good. Question, where did these laws of good come from that God has to follow if He is God? So the Sunnis were not at all happy at this whole notion of trying to remove God from the picture, and for them it contradicts Allah being Allah. It contradicts God being God. And so Sunnism preferred Allah's power and Allah's infinite Mashi'a and Qudra, basically that Allah is the Rabb. Sunnism always preferred the rights of Allah over the rights of man. And Mu'tazilism, they kind of sort of are preferring the rights of man. Allah is obliged to do this to us. And we have ultimate justice and free will. And for Sunnis, that talk seemed arrogant and it seemed unbefitting to describe Allah in this manner. And so Sunnism responded to Mu'tazilism. Now, they responded in multiple schools. Within Sunnism, there's multiple schools. You should be aware there are three primary ones to this day. We're only going to go over two of them today. The three primary ones are Asha'ism, Maturidism, and Atharism, or Ibn Taymiyyah, or Salafism, or Hanbalism. These are the three primary schools. We're going to ignore Maturidism for today and just realize that they have their own way, which is slightly different. So, not to get too technical, because we're going to have to talk about this. There are certain things that combine all of these strands, hence they're Sunni. And then there are certain things that separate all of these three strands. Okay, so be aware of this. So let's begin with the next school that comes onto the picture, and that is Ash'arism. Okay, Ash'arism. Its founder, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, died 310 Hijrah, 310 Hijrah. That's pretty late, right? 310 years after the Prophet ﷺ, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari comes along, and his stepfather. So his father died, his mother married one of the icons of Mu'tazilism. So he grew up in a Mu'tazili household. He learned Mu'tazilism, he became a Mu'tazili theologian. At the age of 40, he decided that Mu'tazilism is wrong. According to legends, he saw the process in a dream. And so he gave up Mu'tazilism and he reverted to Sunnism. However, once he reverted to Sunnism, he was able to elaborate a defense of Sunnism that was unprecedented, because the language he's using is the language of Mu'tazilism. You understand this point here, right? Because in the end of the day, Sunnis weren't studying Byzantine theology. They weren't studying what is called kalam, is the technical term. Sunnis weren't studying, the term is called kalam. They were opposed to kalam. Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari was born and raised in that kalam paradigm. And he absorbed Mu'tazilism. Then he decided to depart and return to Sunnism. But when he returned, he was able to dialogue and discourse and extrapolate a mechanism of defense that was unprecedented. It's using the language of kalam, but refuting what had hitherto been kalam. Okay? And in the process, this new group comes along that is called Ash'arism. Now, Ash'arism, generally speaking, wanted to oppose Mu'tazilism in all of these issues. I'm being very simplistic, but there is definitely a kernel of truth. If the Mu'tazila said up, the Ash'ari said down. If the Mu'tazila said dark, the Asha'ira said light. Literally, it was just they wanted to oppose so that they demonstrated they are different. So, the Ash'arites said, every single phrase that you said, O Mu'tazilas, we disagree with it. Every single phrase. Where do we begin? For the Ash'arites, to describe something as good or evil in the first place is something we cannot do. Like, even this is not a given. We have no right to describe an action as good or evil, as pure or impure. The mind has no role to play. It is Allah who decides, not us. We might say something is good or something is evil, but we have no right. It is mistaken. Allah decides, not us. The mind has no role to play in giving these adjectives. Who are you to decide what is good, what is evil? In fact, everything Allah does by definition must be good and just. Allah cannot do injustice. The Mu'tazila said, Allah must be just. And therefore, and they extrapolated a whole theology. The Asha'ira said, there is no action that Allah could possibly do that anybody could call unjust, because that would mean there's a judge above. That would mean there's a higher moral authority. Who gets to judge the judger? Who gets to judge the judge himself? You see the question here, right? For the Asha'ira, for the Ash'arites, no one has the right to describe any action of Allah as being unjust or evil. By definition, what Allah does must be good. And if He were to destroy the entire creation or to punish the entire world, what moral authority does anybody have to say that is wrong? There is no higher power. When Allah is the creator, and Allah is the Rabb, and Allah is the Khaliq, and Allah Azza wa Jal is the one who initiates everything, then by what order or by what epistemology are you going to dare say that, astaghfirullah, Allah might commit an injustice when He does something? According to whom? According to which laws? According to which judge? So for the Ash'arites, in giving the efficiency, the power to Allah, they went all the way to the max, and they said, Allah is so powerful that there is nothing He could do that could possibly be described as being unjust. He has the right to do as He pleases. There are no values and judgments independent of what Allah Himself does. And there are no obligations upon Allah. So Allah can do as He pleases, and none have the right to judge Him. Therefore, since He doesn't have to answer to any other being, since He is the supreme God, evil as a concept perhaps doesn't even exist, because Allah has the right to do as He pleases. So humans are not the creators of their actions, because Allah is in charge. Whatever happens, happens directly by Allah. Allah causes everything. Allah causes the leaf to fall. Allah causes the drop of rain to go exactly where it goes. Allah Azza wa Jal is literally, effectively operating every atom of creation at every instance. And so this led actually the Asha'irites to have a claim that unless you are taught it or hear it, it sounds very bizarre. They denied something called causality. Causality means when you light a fire to cotton, everybody understands and believes the fire sets alight the cotton. When you throw a rock into the window, the rock breaks the window. This is called causality. In the Ash'arite theology, since Allah is directly in charge of every atom of creation at every instance, to say that the match was what caused the cotton ball to be set alight is a type of shirk. It is not the match that sets the cotton alight, it is Allah directly who happens to do it. You have an illusion of a causality. It is not the match that causes the cotton ball to be set aflame, it is Allah. But there are illusions that Allah has created, we call the laws of nature, and that's how we live our lives. But in reality, when the glass breaks the rock, it is not the glass that broke the rock, it is not the rock that broke the glass, it is Allah that broke the glass at the time when the rock hit the glass. The rock has nothing to do with the glass breaking. Hence, man is not directly responsible for his actions in terms of will. But Allah Azza wa Jal has caused them to acquire the good and the evil of their actions, even though they don't will their good and their evil. I know it sounds, you have to think about it, but let me repeat. Man's will is not efficient. Man's desire to do something doesn't cause the thing to be done. Remember, there's no causality for them. Allah is in charge. So, Allah creates everything that man does. Not man, because the Mu'tazili said the man is the one who does it. Allah creates. However, man acquires. The Arabic term is kasb. Man acquires. What does man acquire? The good and the bad sin, or the good deeds or the sin. Man acquires. And if somebody were to say that's not fair, the Ash'arites would say, who are you to judge what Allah is doing? You have no right to judge Allah's actions. Allah Azza wa Jal does as He pleases. None have the right to question Him. He is the one who questions others. So, since humans don't cause their own actions, in this paradigm, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be judged by human standards. We simply submit and resign ourselves to what is happening, and we do not assume that our intellect has the capacity to understand this wisdom. We relegate to Allah. Allah is in charge. Everything that happens because of Allah. And by definition, what Allah does is just because He cannot do any injustice. By definition, what He does must be good because He cannot do any evil. And if there are repercussions of pain, of evil, that is our fallible, incorrect, temporal assessments. It is not in actual existence evil. So the entire project of theodicy is a failed project because you assumed that your mind can grasp Allah. Stop thinking about it. It is a failed project. You are not qualified to think about Allah. You're not qualified to judge Allah. All of these assumptions you have need to be eliminated. Basically, who are you to question the authority, the power of Allah? Who are you to try to understand? So there is a subservience. And to be brutally honest, at some level, there is a spiritual power there. At some level, you have to admit that they're giving Allah ultimate supremacy. And of course, that is really great, right? Of course, it doesn't really solve for many of us the problem of theodicy. But for them, they would say, this problem should not be a part of your dialogue in the first place. It is your finite mind attempting to judge Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, for the Ash'arites, therefore, they wanted to address theodicy in a radically different manner. And that is by claiming that good and evil themselves are not comprehensible to the mind. When you say something is evil, right there you made a mistake. How could you say something is evil? When you say something is unjust, who are you? Allah is justice, and everything He does, He has the right to do. By what moral authority? Allah is not obliged to do anything. Who told you that Allah must do this and Allah must do that? And by the way, you have to admit there's an element of great, spirituality, because when you hear non-Muslims, when you hear atheists, when you hear people who are arrogant against God, they say, it's not fair. I want this and I want that. I mean, even we even if we're not purely Ash'ari, you're like, who exactly are you to demand anything from Allah? What gives you the right to make all of these long list of demands? You are the makhluk, Allah is the khaliq. You are the marbub, Allah is the Rabb. So the Ash'arites resign themselves to Allah's wisdom, Allah's Qadr, Allah's Mashi'a, and they basically say, we are Allah's makhluk and Allah can do as He pleases. It's not our role to question, much less to understand. And all of these notions of justice and evil and whatnot, we don't have the capacity to put these adjectives on anything. And by definition, Allah cannot do injustice, because to say that Allah can do injustice, according to them, would imply there is a moral code higher than Allah, that He has to ascribe to a sharia, if you like, right? That is higher than Him. And that doesn't make any sense if you understand who is God and what's that. So this is the Ash'arite understanding of theodicy. The understanding that we'll conclude with is that of Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah was the primary intellectual of the Athari school. And I argue that without him, we wouldn't really have Atharism or Salafism. Ibn Taymiyyah was one of the only minds, if not the only mind, that was basically, intelligent enough, well-read, erudite, to actually extrapolate for this trend a defense mechanism that was worthy of engaging with the Mu'tazila and the Ash'arites. Before him and also after him, by and large, that trend did not produce that level of intellectual scholarship. And that's just my opinion. I know it gets a lot of pushback, but I challenge you to go find somebody before Ibn Taymiyyah that wrote even a fraction like Ibn Taymiyyah wrote. Ibn Taymiyyah was the greatest defense lawyer that this trend ever had. Without him, that trend would look very different than it does today. So Ibn Taymiyyah was able to extrapolate a defense mechanism for his strand of Sunnism, which is the strand that is now called Salafism. And it is awkward to say this, but it is clear to most people, including myself, that Ibn Taymiyyah did take aspects of Mu'tazili thought and Maturidi thought and formulated a unique doctrine, because he's coming after all of them. And his doctrines or his defense mechanism is in between Ash'arism and Mu'tazilism. Okay? His defense is quite clearly situated in the middle of these two. And people say, I also say I've moved on from Salafism, but I am still Taymiyyan at heart, and you'll see this even now. His views on these aspects appeal to me. His views on theodicy are, to me, the sensible ones, right? And I will say, Ibn Taymiyyah had the benefit of hindsight. Ibn Taymiyyah is coming, 720, right? Whereas Al-Ash'ari and these guys are coming 300, 400 Hijrah. So Ibn Taymiyyah has the benefit to see all that has happened, to read all of the books, and then to extrapolate. So we give him that indeed, when you're coming at the end of a long bunch of research, you can actually produce even greater research. Nonetheless, I do believe that what he posited kind of sort of saves, because both of these trends, of course, I am biased because I am pro Ibn Taymiyyah in this regard. I'm not satisfied with Mu'tazilism. I'm not satisfied with Ash'arism, right? Ibn Taymiyyah's solution to me does make more sense. Now, what does Ibn Taymiyyah say? Well, of course, Ibn Taymiyyah is Sunni. So when he's Sunni, he is not going to affirm ultimate free will. Understand, Sunnis do not affirm unconditional free will. Because that would, when you affirm, because we're going to come to free will maybe in a few weeks or so. The problem of free will, you are balancing between two non-negotiables. The reality of justice of Allah, that we should be accounted for what we do, and the reality of the power of Allah, that Allah is in charge of the world. These are the two things that are clashing, right? On the one hand, it seems unfair. Why would Allah force us? On the other hand, when you strip that, then you're saying Allah Azza wa Jalla is letting us be mini gods. So there's no easy reconciliation. We're going to come to this later on. By the way, so even this issue of theodicy, it does have a direct relationship with free will and predetermination. You understand this point. So this is a crash course on these three groups. Memorize them. We're going to come back to these three groups when we talk about predestination. And I will assume then that you know these three groups and we won't have to go over them all over again. So what does Ibn Taymiyyah argue? Ibn Taymiyyah argues that, of course, Allah has the ultimate control. However, he posited, this is really interesting, there are two types of Allah willing something, Allah desiring something. When Allah desires something, when Allah says kun fayakun, when Allah wills something, in Arabic the irada, Allah's irada is not one category, it is two. This is something that solves a lot of problems. Allah's irada is two categories. The irada that is kawniyya and the irada that is shar'iyya. I'll explain both. Irada kawniyya. Allah wills something into existence, but the fact that it is willed into existence does not mean that Allah approves of it. Allah wills something into existence, but Allah willing it into existence does not mean Allah approves of it. Irada shar'iyya. Allah desires something to happen, but He does not will it into existence. So, for example, the word irada, the word qada, both of them can be applied here. Allah says in the Quran, وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُ إِلَّا إِيَّهُ. Your Lord has decreed, it's a decree, that none shall be worshipped except Him. And your Lord has decreed you shall be good to your parents. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. Question: is other than Allah worshipped on earth? Yes or no? Are people rude to their parents? Yes or no? So how do we understand that Allah is saying your Lord has decreed, Allah's Qadr wa Qada, Allah has made Qada that only He shall be worshipped? How are other than Allah worshipped? Then in another verse Allah says فَقَضَاهُنَّ سَبْعَ سَمَاوَاتٍ. Allah made qada that there's going to be 7 heavens and 7 earths, and Allah created this and Allah created that. That we know exists. Ibn Taymiyyah says the same word qadr is used for one aspect, that is a desire He wants, but He doesn't enact it. It is His will. That irada, which is irada shar'iyya, is always pure and good. And He wants it, but He doesn't necessarily force it. The irada kawniyya is what happens on earth, but He doesn't necessarily approve of it. Okay, so by demarcating, by dividing this type of concept, that not everything that happens Allah approves, and what Allah approves does not necessarily happen because He's willed it not to happen. Allah desires that only He be worshipped, but He has not enforced it. And Allah Azza wa Jal has created the 7 heavens and He has enforced it. So, based upon this, the irada kawniyya, the kawn is the creation. Ibn Taymiyyah argues, the irada kawniyya might have repercussions that are evil. This is a key point of Ibn Taymiyyah, listen to this. And the irada shar'iyya never has any repercussions that are evil. Whatever Allah wants you to be pious, that's irada shar'iyya. Allah wants you to pray, Allah wants you to give to the orphans, that's irada shar'iyya. That's always pure, always good. Irada kawniyya, the one that happens, Ibn Taymiyyah says, sometimes there are repercussions from that are harmful or pure. But, listen to this, even then, the good that will come, the sum total good that will come, will always be more than the sum total evil. Ibn Taymiyyah very forcefully argues there is no such thing as an irada kawniyya that is inherently evil and nothing but evil. In other words, he argues there is no such thing as pure evil in the first place. There are partial evils, and those partial evils have the potential to extrapolate from them more good than evil, more benefit than harm. And the believer is equipped to always maximize the good from the harm. What Iman does, what Islam does, what belief in Allah does, is it gives you the paradigm to always extrapolate more good from a situation than bad, more positive than negative. And hence, for Ibn Taymiyyah, there is no such thing as pure evil in this world. And the believer, now for the non-believer, sometimes an issue will have more evil than good. But even then, there will also be some good. There's no such thing as pure evil. In fact, Ibn Qayyim took this to the logical conclusion. Ibn Qayyim actually has like 10, 15 pages in one of his books where he says, even in the creation of Iblees, there is good. There is some good. He's not saying that there's nothing but good. He's saying even in the creation of Iblees, there is wisdom and good. He's trying to prove this point. There's no such thing as pure evil. That's another talk we can give at another time. So, Ibn Taymiyyah argued that the existence of evil, of harm, of pain, it serves a divine purpose, a wise purpose, some of which the mind can comprehend, unlike what the Asha'iri said. Some of it, you will understand that good, and you will recognize that good in your life. And he also said, and some of it, it is beyond our understanding, for sure. So Ibn Taymiyyah says rationality plays a partial role. The Ash'ari said rationality plays no role. And the Mu'tazili says rationality plays the ultimate role. Ibn Taymiyyah says your mind plays a partial role. You can, if you really think about it, and you're wise, and you're believing in Allah, every bad situation, your mind will be able to extrapolate some good. There's a wisdom, there's a reason why it happened. And even if you don't understand it, the good that you derive from a situation, from a bad situation, so the good that you derive from an evil situation will always be more than the evil, even if you don't understand it. That is what Ibn Taymiyyah argued. So, to summarize in this, that Ibn Taymiyyah basically said that although the mind cannot fully comprehend Allah's wisdom, the mind can partially comprehend what is good and what is evil, what is pain and what is suffering, and we understand when something is bad, and we have the right to call it bad, but, however, we must always humble ourselves that Allah's knowledge is infinite. And even if we can extrapolate some wisdoms, even if we cannot fully extrapolate all, we trust Allah, that Allah has a wisdom and a purpose for whatever happens to us. And Ibn Taymiyyah also said that, of course, some actions of Allah can be unjust. He disagreed with the Ash'arites who said, by definition, Allah cannot act unjustly. Whatever Allah does has to be justice. Ibn Taymiyyah said, no, Allah Azza wa Jal can act unjustly, but He's chosen not to. And He mentions in the Quran, Allah says, وَمَا رَبُّكَ بِظَلَّامٍ لِلْعَبِيدِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَظْلِمُ. Allah does not do injustice. Ibn Taymiyyah says, how can Allah negate something from Him that He's not capable of doing? He's negating it because if He wanted to, He could, but He's not doing it. Because Allah is perfect, He has negated injustice. And what is injustice? Injustice would be, Ibn Taymiyyah says, to punish somebody for a crime somebody else has done. That is injustice. And Allah, if He wanted to, could, but Allah says, I'm not going to do that, because Allah is all perfect. And one key point, and this is really simplistic, but it has to be said in a very simplistic manner. So before the critics criticize, I have to give the caveat, right? Because I have to be careful every time I say something, 20 videos come out. So this is simplistic on purpose. This is not an advanced class in this topic of Qadr. Very simplistically, the Mu'tazila said free will is ultimate. The Asha'ira said there is no free will. And Ibn Taymiyyah said, free will is something that Allah has allowed for us partially within a purview. Allah has given us a mashia, but that mashia is within Allah's mashia. I know it's technical, but I mean, just understand this. It's between the three, right? Between the two. Where the Asha'ira said, there is the illusion of free will. We don't actually have free will. And the Mu'tazila said, you have ultimate free will. And Ibn Taymiyyah said, there is causality. The rock breaks the glass. The fire causes the cotton. Allah creates the causality, and causality exists. And therefore, our will has an impact on our actions. But it's not as if Allah is, astaghfirullah, an absent God. No, Allah is in charge. And Allah has willed us to have that will. Even though we have that will, still Allah is the one in charge of that will. So it is a kind of middle position. And I know that position isn't fully satisfying in terms of free will. We're going to come back to this point here. And with this, let me just finish off with one final paradigm, which is not that common at all. So we talked about the Mu'tazila, we talked about the Asha'ira, we talked about the Atharis. There are other paradigms as well. One of them is that of the philosophers, the falasifa. And the most famous philosopher of our tradition is Ibn Sina, Avicenna. Ibn Sina, all of you have heard of the name Ibn Sina. And Ibn Sina also discussed the issue of theodicy. I just thought I'd quickly summarize in 2-3 sentences. Ibn Sina, his version of God and of theodicy was radically different than that of any of these groups. Why? Because Ibn Sina was not believing in a God that we recognize as a God. I know that sounds blasphemous, but there's no other way to say this. Ibn Sina is not coming from the Abrahamic paradigm. The Abrahamic paradigm believes in a God that is living, hearing, seeing, that knows you. You reach out to Him, you make dua to Him. Allah can intervene in your life. Allah will create a miracle for you. Allah will do this and that. You're making dua. There's a connection. There's a God that is a part of your life. This is the Abrahamic God. Ibn Sina and the philosophers were what we would call deists. God created the world and let it be. God is not actively involved in our lives. God is not in charge of us. God doesn't even know we exist as individuals. And that's why Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah and others, they said this is blasphemy. This guy is preaching doctrines that are against the Quran. They literally considered Ibn Taymiyyah's doctrines to be kufr. Al-Ghazali has a famous book about this, right? Because obviously that type of God, I mean, it's a different type of God. So obviously if you follow that, then your version of theodicy will be radically different, right? Radically different. For Ibn Sina, evil does not actually exist. It is simply the absence of good. And by the way, you still hear these motifs amongst modern philosophers. The same thing, you hear them, right? For Ibn Sina, evil is merely the absence of good. And the absence of good sometimes are caused by natural disasters and sometimes are caused by the immorality of mankind. And for Ibn Sina, the existence of evil is necessary to demonstrate the imperfection of the world, to imply that only God is all perfect. So the existence of the absence of good, which is evil, the existence of evil serves the highest purpose. Rather than it becoming a problem for theodicy, Ibn Sina flips the script. And he says we need evil, basically, to prove the world is imperfect and it requires a perfect creator. So for Ibn Sina, he also argued that, somewhat similar to Ibn Taymiyyah in this, is that there's no such thing as pure evil. And he actually gives the example of the lion and the gazelle. So the lion hunting the gazelle is evil for the gazelle, but it is necessary for the lion. So for Ibn Sina, in the grand scale of things, nothing is actually evil per se. There is just, relative evil. God has nothing to do with this creation. Rather, its existence, far from presenting a theological dilemma, actually requires us to believe in the dependency of the imperfect creation upon the perfection of the one creator that willed it into existence. And again, if you understand Ibn Sina's theology, Ibn Sina's version of God, so I don't want to go there today, so it's very complicated. If you ever read Ibn Sina's version of God, you will not recognize him as the God of the Quran. He is a power, a force. It's just Allah Azza wa Jal does not even will us into existence. He doesn't say kun fayakun for Ibn Sina. So creation is basically like a trickle down of a vast ocean is just trickling down. We are like the 10th order of creation. We are something far removed from the ultimate. And the fact that we're a trickle, a stream, the fact that we have pebbles and rocks and stones, it shows there is a perfect entity 10 steps away that brought about this imperfect stream, if you like, if I'm giving a very simple analogy, right? So for Ibn Sina, it was a very different understanding of theodicy, and he had no problem at all with it because he can flip the script and say, it actually proves for me that there must be a perfect entity out there, and that entity is called, God or Wajib al-Wujud. So with that, inshallah, we can open the floor for Q&A. Do we have some slides or any before we any questions from the hands? Anybody has raise your hands here? Bismillah, yes, go ahead. Did the Sahaba ever ask the Prophet these questions? Nope, not at all. Never. And again, that shows us what simple faith does, right? We have to also understand that a lot of these questions, we are problematizing them because of the environment we find ourselves in, right? And it is what it is. You can't solve it. It's not our fault we're hearing these questions. We have to solve them. But the Sahaba's iman was very... And here's another point. I didn't want to go here today, but I'll just jump to script. This was for next week. All of these that I summarize for you, it is factually correct to point out. Listen to this, guys. Listen to this. Theodicy as a concept was far more troubling to the Western mind than it was to the Eastern mind. This is a deeper topic. There are schools of philosophy, and Western philosophy, tapping into the pre-Socratic and then Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and that entire trajectory, the questions of Western philosophy were very different than the questions of Eastern philosophy. And the way that Western philosophy solved it is radically different than the way Eastern philosophy solved it as well. Okay? We're getting very deep here. Understand this point. And the question of trying to understand why God would create suffering and pain and evil seems to be far more a topic of obsession in Western philosophy. In Eastern philosophy, look at, for example, the concept of dharma, the concept of dukkhi, the concept in Buddhism of pain, right? The concept, they just take it for granted. And the question is how you deal with it, not why it's there, right? Eastern philosophy is more about experiential. That's why they say mysticism, right? And Western philosophy is more about analytical, as well as intellectual. Again, really simplistic, but these are kernels of truth to them, right? Eastern philosophy didn't problematize the existence of God because of pain and suffering. They were worried, or they were concerned with, what do we do to overcome it? And that's, for example, Buddhism. The entire strand of Buddhism is literally how to overcome pain and suffering. Not the issue of God, the issue of how you live your life in spite of that pain. So this leads us to a key point which we keep on going back to. We all have to understand the biases we have when we approach our tradition with these very questions that are being uploaded to us from our environment. We can't help it. It's not a problem. I'm not criminalizing me and you. I can't help where I was born. But the types of problems we are having and the questions we're having, we have to humble ourselves that the reason why we're having these is because these are the questions of a culture, a civilization that is far removed from our original one, and we happen to be born and raised in it. We're going to come back to this exact notion when it comes to LGBT, when it comes to gender, when it comes to all of these aspects. When it comes to quite a lot of problems that modern Muslims have with Islam, those problems are actually coming from absorbing value systems that they're not even thinking about, inherently absorbing it. So, good question. I hope, inshallah, that answers it. So, definition, question is, why didn't you include the Maturidis? Because of time. I have nothing against them, guys. Don't read in anything. Why only the Mu'tazila, Asha'ira, and Athariya? Again, they're just time. I have nothing against them. They are definitely one of the major schools of Islam. Number one. Number two, Ibn Taymiyyah and the Maturidis are very, very close to each other. So you can almost substitute Ibn Taymiyyah for Maturidis over here. Question here that you mentioned the creation of Iblis is not inherently evil. However, he was not in this evil, vindictive state until he received his response to refusing to bow down to Adam. Is that what the non-evil is referring to? No. So Ibn al-Qayyim mentions that Allah Azza wa Jal obviously allowed for the creation of Iblis, and Allah knew what would happen. And in the creation of Iblis, Ibn al-Qayyim argues, there is wisdom and benefit for the believer. And that wisdom and benefit doesn't justify the evil that Iblis is doing, but for the believer, the good that happens for him in his life with the existence of Iblis is more than the bad. Because again, we're being relative here. We're not saying the good of Iblis is more than the evil Iblis, right? We're saying for the believer, in the believer's iman that Allah Azza wa Jal has created this entity. Ibn al-Qayyim mentions, for example, I have a long lecture somewhere online, The Wisdom of the Creation of Iblis, given almost 10 years ago. And this was summary of Ibn al-Qayyim. For example, Ibn al-Qayyim says, imagine if there were no enemy, there were no Iblis. Your guard would be let down to the level of complete annihilation. You would be destroyed. When you know there's an enemy that is constantly watching you, constantly wanting to attack you, automatically your defense mechanisms are going to be skyrocket high. Knowing there's an enemy watching you from a place that you cannot watch him from. And knowing that he's burning with rage and jealousy. And knowing that he wants to misguide you with these exact tactics that the Quran mentions. It is following shahawat, following shubuhat, waswasa, nisyan, all of these tactics in the Quran. Allah has told you the tactics of Iblis and the personality of Iblis. What more do you want? You know your enemy's psychology. This is training you to be even more powerful. And obviously, in fighting against Iblis, you will gain your reward and Jannah. Inshallah, let's finish up here. Final question. Let's see. Again, Maturidis again. Sorry guys, I did nothing against the Maturidis, man. It's like next time I better be careful. I'll skip the Asha'is and just do Maturidis. So question here. I have a coworker who's agnostic. He's interested in Islam. However, he keeps on asking, why does Allah allow suffering like genocide in Gaza? What is the easiest answer to explain to him? That's a very difficult question because there is no easy answer, and it really depends on the psychology and the theology of the person. Typically, I will answer this question with what I said to you last week. But again, there's no watertight, foolproof answer. It depends on the person you're talking to. Typically, I will answer this question like I said to you last week, which is the question of theodicy should never lead to doubting Allah's existence. The max you can do is say, I don't understand the wisdom of why there's evil. It doesn't change the fact there is pain and suffering and there is a creation around us. If you can't understand why there's pain, you still must acknowledge there is a creation, and that means there's a creator. So to reject the creator because you cannot understand the wisdom of an aspect of creation makes no sense. The max you should do, humble yourself and say, I don't have an answer to this. Now let me see within the religions, because you're saying your friend is an agnostic, which means he doesn't believe in a God. And again, to reject Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because you cannot understand why, not only have you still retained the problem of evil, it's still there, you have now created a much longer list of problems that you don't have an answer to, which is, why are you here? Who created you? What is the purpose of life? So I would simply say that stick with the basics and approach him with the understanding of, the simple understanding of, look around you. Allah says in the Quran, look at the creation. Don't you see? Is there any flaw? هل ترى من فطور? So use the simple Quranic arguments. You don't need complicated proofs to prove the existence of Allah. The creation proves there is a God. Then the question arises, which God is it and what should you do? And that's where you bring in the basics of Tawheed. Inshallah, with this, all the rest is fiqhi stuff which we don't want to get into, inshallah. So let us, inshallah, pause here for today, and inshallah we will continue bi-idhnillahi ta'ala next week. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
فيا ذلي خجلي إذا ما قال لي ربي أما استحييته تعصيني ولا تخشى من العتب وتخفي الذنب عن خلقي وتأبى في الهوى قربي فتب مما جنيت عسى تعود إلى رضا الرب تعود إلى رضا الرب